I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening, and I'd like to say that it is my divine pleasure to introduce Dr. Ken Tape tonight. Dr. Tape, is one of the reasons that it makes it joyous for me to come to work in the morning. He is a versatile researcher. He has a lot of great ideas, and he is an interesting person to be around. Ken is an ecologist, and he graduated from Carleton College in 1999 with a degree in geology. Yes. And he got a master's degree from UAF in geology, and then a PhD from UAF in biological sciences. Now, I work in the Institute of Northern Engineering, the Water and Environmental Research Center. Ken Tape is an ecologist that has come to the Water and Environmental Research Center because environmental research involves the environment, which is ecology. Now, most ecologists take a single set of things, like nitrogen cycling, for instance, and look at them in different environments. So they might look at nitrogen cycling in the Arctic, and in the desert, and in the high plains, and so forth. Or they might take carbon cycling, or they might take lake processes in all those different environments. But Ken Tape does all the ecological processes and focuses them in the Arctic because he is intensely interested in Arctic processes. And that is kind of the unifying concept of Ken's work. Now, Ken came to work for us in 2013, we were very excited to hire him on. He came and said, hey, Bill, okay, I'm starting this new job, but one thing I want to do is I have a museum exhibit that's going to travel all over the United States. So here's this museum exhibit, please take care of this. Now, I'm an engineer and don't know how to deal with museum exhibits, but Ken showed me how. He had a series of pictures called the Changing Arctic Landscape, based upon his book. And throughout his career at UAF so far, he has been kind of vamping on that theme. Tonight's presentation is about beavers in the Arctic. And it follows on the same theme of changing Arctic landscape because Dr. Tape has noticed that when beavers come to a new place, they change the landscape. So, with that, one more point. When you ask questions of Ken at the end, if you sing your question, he will harmonize with you. However you say it, he'll harmonize. So that's fine. Ken?
Can you believe that guy's my boss? Thank you, Bill. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Everyone hear me all right? It's loud enough back there? All right, cool. Thanks for coming out. Thanks again to Fritz Freudenberger for organizing this, as well as Sue Mitchell for not just my talk, but the whole series. I think the first one of these Science for Alaska talks I came to was back in the early 90s. I was in high school, and I did get extra credit, but nonetheless, it was an inspiring talk, and so here I am. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me. Tonight I'm going to talk about beaver colonization of the Arctic. We've been working on this for a little less than a year. So it's a very new project, and there's about a half a dozen of us. I'm presenting results on behalf of this group, and so I want to mention my collaborators because they've put a lot of effort into this as well. Ben Jones at the USGS Alaska Science Center in Anchorage, Chris Arp at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Ingmar Nietzsche and Guido Grossa are at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany, and then Chris Zimmerman from the Alaska Science Center. So a quick outline, I'm going to talk about changes in, oh, you know, look at that full moon. That's appropriate, isn't it? You know, it's almost like I meant to do that. No, it's not. It could have been. So anyway, I'm going to talk about changes in tundra habitat. So changes in the Arctic landscape over the last maybe sort of 20 to 150 years, and how that translates into wildlife habitat, how wildlife habitat's been changing up there, and also how that may have affected the distribution of beavers and other herbivore browsers up in the Arctic. And I'm actually going to start with moose and snowshoe hares before I get to beavers. This kind of follows the chronology of how I got into the beaver question, and I think it'll be really apparent when we start talking about moose and snowshoe hares how that relates to beavers. All right, so a lot of you will be familiar with this. I won't belabor it too much, but one of the primary landscape changes that's occurring in the Arctic is that, you know, the summer's longer, it's warmer up there, and so you get more and taller, more extensive shrubby vegetation. And so this picture on the left, this is from the Nimiuktuk River in the western Brooks Range. This is a tundra environment. And you know, if you look at these shrubs here, those are 2 and 3 meter, well, I guess I wasn't there in 1950 to measure them, but those are willow shrubs mixed in with a few alder shrubs and maybe a few birch shrubs, you know, maybe head high or a little bit taller. And by 2002, you can see that those shrubs have really expanded out from these little creeks and streams. This is not the Nimiuktuk River here. This is just a little creek flowing down to it. But so you can see how the shrubs have expanded on the landscape, as you might expect if you're getting, you know, warmer and longer summers. So here's another example. This is a river floodplain. This is the Anaktuvik River on the central north slope. If you look at the picture from 1950, you can see a lot of unvegetated sandbars, a lot of exposed areas, and by the time you get to 2006, you can see that the whole floodplain is stabilized, and a lot of those sandbars have grown up with shrubby vegetation. And you know, floodplains aren't necessarily the first place you'd look for the signs of climate change, because they're naturally dynamic environments. But we see this pattern of infilling on the floodplains across the North Slope. And this is not just something we see in Alaska. This has now been, you know, people have been documenting this across the Arctic for about 20 years. And so my interest was, how do these changes in shrub growth, this more extensive tall shrub habitat on the North Slope, how does that potentially affect some of these herbivore browsers, moose, snowshoe hares, and beavers? So we'll talk about moose here for a few minutes. So here's a picture from the Nanushuk River. This river flows north out of the Brooks Range. You're looking south here, so that's probably the Continental Divide at the top of the picture. And this is a pretty typical, you know, Brooks Range view, or even a North Slope view without the mountains. But there's no moose habitat in this picture. It'd be really unusual if you saw a moose wandering around out here. There's no tall shrubs. There's very little for them to eat. There's nowhere to hide. And this is pretty typical of, you know, 99% of the Alaskan Arctic. Here's another picture. This is west of Toolik, maybe 10 miles. And once again, you know, there's no habitat for a moose, or a beaver for that matter, or snowshoe hare, but you know, they need these shrubs for habitat. And so the vast majority of the North Slope doesn't have suitable habitat for these shrub herbivores. And now here's a spot where you do see a little bit of shrub habitat on the North Slope. This is near Galbraith Lake, just on the north edge of the Brooks Range. And I actually set up, so this is April 27th, 2012. So I set up 28 cameras in a whole bunch of different places, a little ways off the Dalton Highway, basically stretching from the Brooks Range to the coastal plain. And I looked at something like, the cameras ran every 15 minutes, they took a picture for a month. And these were the only moose that I saw in that entire month from those 28 different cameras. Not surprisingly, it was in one of the shrubbiest places. This is actually a relatively shrubby spot if you've been up to Toolik, for example. And these moose were actually in this frame for maybe 6 or 8 hours, but this is the best view I got of them. The entire time they're buried down in this shrub patch right here, eating willows, and then they lay down, you know, over here kind of out of sight. resting and then eating shrubs. But the point is, they love that shrub habitat, and people who have hunted moose know that they love cover, and particularly in the winter. Because unlike caribou, caribou are adapted to dig through the snow for their forage, right? But moose are not. So as the snow accumulates up there, and you get those white landscapes like the last couple slides I showed you, there's just nothing for them to eat. So they have to be down in these riparian areas with the tall willows during winter. And Ned Roselle gave me this little tip here from Tom Seaton at ADF&G. Moose eat a garbage bag of willow tips per day. So, it kind of explains why a shrub patch like this, which isn't really that big in the grand scheme of things, they spend about a half a day here and then they're moving on. And so you can perhaps get a sense for, if this is our situation in 1957 or let's say 1900, and we look at the change between 1957 and 2007, I started to get to thinking that maybe, with shrub expansion, in the tundra, moose, if we go back in time 100, 150 years, maybe we won't see moose in the tundra environment at all. Maybe there won't be any in the tundra environment. And so that notion that, by going back in time and seeing if moose were there, that kind of inspired me so I went through these historical records, indigenous accounts, and tried to create this map of moose distribution in northern Alaska over the last maybe 130 years. So you can see tree line is this green line here, right? So everything north and west of tree line is tundra. Fairbanks is right down here. So you can see that they've moved into the tundra during the last century. And which is kind of amazing. I mean, for someone who grew up in Fairbanks, and a lot of you have similarly grown up in Fairbanks or been here for a while, we know that moose are everywhere. We see moose everywhere. They're sort of part of the landscape here, but it turns out that about a century ago, they were not part of the tundra landscape, and it seems that they've colonized the tundra during the last century. And we think that is related to this increase in shrub habitat. But as with many stories in ecology, it's more complicated than that, because there's another factor that played an important role, or could have played an important role, in this expansion of moose, and that is the cessation of hunting, or a reduction in hunting, starting 100 or 120 years ago. And I could probably give a whole separate talk on, which one of these, sort of teasing apart these various factors in influencing moose to wander into the tundra, but I think we do need to take that theory very seriously, this change in hunting practice, and but we think that a lot of this pattern that we're seeing here is a result of increasing moose habitat. So I've got a little picture of a snowshoe hare in the corner here. We think snowshoe hares are doing making a similar move. The problem is that we don't have great snowshoe hare records going back 100 years. You can imagine how hard it is to show absence of a creature in such a vast and remote area as the North Slope. So we think that snowshoe hares, for example, have moved into the Colville River basin. There's a lot of good shrub habitat down here. And we think that snowshoe hares have shifted their distribution northward in the last half century. But really, I think the jury's still out on a lot of this in terms of what's driving these patterns. As time goes on, it'll be interesting to see if other boreal shrub-loving species also move into the tundra or not. All right, so we talked a little bit about moose and snowshoe hares, sort of exploiting the increases in their habitat over the last 50 to 100 years. Let's talk about beavers here. All right, so this is my big text slide here, and I'm just going to read this off. I took these verbatim from the ADF&G they've got a web page where they have a bunch of information on beavers. So I just want to read these out so people, I'm sure people are familiar with this, but I'll read them anyway. The beaver is found throughout most forested portions of the state. To survive, beavers must be assured of 2 or 3 feet of water year-round, 0.6 to 0.9 meters for all the scientists in the room. Water provides a refuge from enemies and a way to float and transport heavy objects such as branches and logs for food and construction. Food for winter use must be stored in underwater food caches during autumn, which is like August or September in the tundra, right? The beaver colony is governed largely by food supply. So I guess it was maybe a year and a half ago, I had the realization that we might be able to detect the movement of beavers into the tundra, or out of the tundra for that matter, by looking at the formation and disappearance of beaver ponds from space, because we can see the formation and disappearance of those ponds from space. So by looking at those ponds and identifying which ones are formed by beavers, we might be able to track their movement into the tundra. So here's a similar view as the last Alaska map. This time, just to confuse you guys, I put the tree line in orange. And Fairbanks is just a little bit out of the picture down here. Tree line, that has historically been the beaver range limit. All right, so beavers, like moose 100 years ago, beavers 50 years ago would not have been in a tundra species. It's confined to the boreal forest. The white arrows are predicted colonization routes, okay? So that has not happened yet. Those are predictions. The pluses on the Seward Peninsula, we know that there's a lot more beaver activity here than there used to be. And the yellow arrows are observations from the last year and a half. So this arrow is actually one beaver dam. There was a little note in the journal Arctic about a year ago that claimed that there was a new beaver dam on the Babbage River that hadn't been there before. And so what we did is we took this area of the western Brooks Range here, sort of around Noatak Village, the greater area, and we applied this technique of looking at the formation and disappearance of ponds in that area. So I'm going to show you the preliminary results from that region. So here's that. Let me just go back. We're looking now, we're going to zoom into this area right here. So this is I think Kivalina's down here. This is the Wulik and the Kivalina River right here. I think Red Dog Mine is somewhere up here. This is the lower Noatak watershed. So the Noatak kind of goes this way. The village of Noatak is here. Koski is down here. And we detected 56 new beaver ponds between 1999 and 2014. And so the way that we do that is we used Landsat imagery to detect Landsat imagery that's acquired every single year over large areas, and we use that imagery to detect wetting and drying. And this is where a lot of the collaboration came in. The guys at Alfred Wegener Institute, Guido Grossa and Ingmar Nietzsche, they're already looking at wetting and drying trends across the Arctic for all these lakes. So they're already looking at wetting and drying. And what Ben Jones did at the USGS is he took their output of what areas had wetted and dried, put some additional geographic filters on that so that it would just produce areas that were formed by beavers, ponds that either formed or disappeared due to beavers. And he came out with about a 90% success rate. So he'd get the Landsat imagery, which is pretty coarse, it's like a 30-meter pixel, and then he'd go into the high-res satellite imagery or aerial photography and identify whether or not those lakes were formed by beavers or some other natural process like thermal karst. So that's how we detected these new beaver ponds. And in the same area, only 4 dried. And this is what that looks like in the high-resolution imagery or aerial photography. So 1952 to 1979, you've got a little creek coming down here and a little river. It's dumping into this river. 1952 to 1979, you don't see too many changes. And suddenly in 2005, or sometime just before 2005, you get the arrival of a beaver. And so you get this dam, and you get this beginnings of a wetland forming. And then sometime between 2005 and 2013, the beaver pond shifts slower down and gets somewhat more extensive. I'm not going to spend too much time on the Landsat data, but just to show you how powerful it is, this is a wetness index over here. So higher is wetter, right? And this is year 1998 maybe, or 1999 to 2014. And so if you look at this triangle here, this reddish-orange triangle, you can actually see right here where it jumps up, that is the wetting trend. So the imagery doesn't tell you, the imagery only gives you a window of, well, the beaver arrived between 1979 and 2005, but that's not very satisfactory. The Landsat data, the satellite imagery actually shows that in 2003 or 2004, that pond formed. It actually dried, and then you can see when they, so that upper pond here was formed 2003 to 2005. It reformed in 2006 to 2009. This pond here formed in 2006, so you can see the wetness goes way up and is maintained, and then you can see that this dam broke in 2008. And what's cool about that is so you can look at this whole area and ask questions like, well, what was a good year for beaver colonization? In what year did were a lot of ponds constructed by beavers? Or what was it about 2007? Oh, geez, all those ponds dried in 2007. Was that a long winter? Was that a big spring flood? So you can ask a lot of interesting questions by knowing the exact year that beavers are building these ponds and that they're losing the ponds as well. So here's another example, and I like this example a lot. So 1950 and 1985, you know, for those of us who have pored over this type of time series of satellite imagery a lot, this is pretty typical. I mean, those two images look identical. That's a 35-year interval. And so it's possible that there are probably things that we can't really see from 10,000 feet that are going on there, but nonetheless, it's a pretty stable environment. There's no fire in the Arctic. There's nothing to kind of reset things like we have in the interior. And that's part of what makes it a stable environment. And then suddenly, the beavers arrive. We get some initial dam development, and you get the formation of this pond starts to get a lot bigger, and immediately you get thermokarst. Right? So you're putting this, suddenly you're just dropping this, you're flooding parts of the tundra, you're inundating these areas, and that immediately absorbs more heat than the tundra vegetation that preceded it, and so you get immediate permafrost thaw. By 2012, you could see that the beaver has developed extensive, beavers, it's multiple, have developed extensive dam system down here, and even though part of this is drained, you can still see the thermokarst pits left over from when it was initially flooded. So I think of beavers I use the term agents of disturbance because they bring this disturbance that is otherwise generally absent from the Arctic. They bring that disturbance from outside of the ecosystem and impose their construction and their works on the ecosystem. And it really shakes things up in the Arctic from my perspective. And here's actually what that complex that we were just looking at in the last image, this is what that looks like. This is out on the Seward Peninsula. You can see a beaver lodge right here. There's actually a beaver lodge up here as well, and it's just this elaborate system of if you look in closely, you can see a lot of shrubs that have been taken down for forage and for caching. This photo's by Chris Arp, one of my collaborators. He got this one last summer. So, like I say, we're less than a year into this project, so there's a lot we don't know. But what's most exciting about it, to me, is the implications. how they are going to change the Arctic environment if they continue to move into the Arctic. We know from studies elsewhere, we have a general idea what beavers do, as well as the boreal forest. They inundate valley bottoms. But we think that the Arctic is going to have some unique responses to beaver colonization. And I divide those into the physical implications and the biological implications. The physical implications, thanks to a long history of permafrost science up at the university, the physical implications, I think, are better known. So what's the effect when you put a pond on a landscape where it wasn't there before? Or what happens to water temperature when you make the water deeper? Those are things that we tend to understand a little bit better, whereas the biological implications are still somewhat of a black box. So changes in hydrology lead to permafrost thaw, at least these types of changes in hydrology. If you look at this 1951 picture, this is before the beavers arrive. 2005, we start to see some dams here and here. This stream, it's hard to see, but this is a stream that comes down here. This is where the stream flowed until the beaver showed up. The beaver builds a dam right here, changes the water level, and you get this huge area of thermokarst. This is about 100 meters by 400 meters, so about 100 by 400 meters of collapse permafrost here. And then what happens, because the beaver dams this creek right here, it actually changes direction and takes an entirely new course. Because a lot of these places are low gradient, relatively flat landscapes. So if you put a dam, the creek might just decide to go the other way. And that's what happened here. The creek starts flowing in a different direction, and this is thawing, isolated polygonal ground. And many of you will recognize that. But yeah, the beaver diverts the water over here, and the addition of all that heat and flowing water triggers permafrost thaw. And by 2016, that area has grown, and now, sure enough, the creek is just going a completely different direction. So changes in hydrology lead to permafrost thaw. The other physical implication that I think is pretty obvious is when the beaver builds a dam on a creek, that creek might have a small amount of unfrozen water in it. I mean, you can imagine, a creek that's this deep in the tundra, or maybe it's this deep, but as winter progresses, the ice freezes down, and it often freezes to the bottom, or it freezes pretty close to the bottom. But when you build that dam, you make the water deeper. And as the water gets deeper, it creates more unfrozen water in winter. It creates, because it's deeper water, so down at the bottom, it's unfrozen. That's what the beaver needs to survive, right? It needs the pond, as we saw on that earlier slide, it needs the pond so it can access its cache and avoid predators, and et cetera, et cetera. So that warmer water in the winter is a big deal, because not only do we now have this oasis of warm water in the landscape, but it's leaking. It's not just a localized effect, it's leaking water out of that dam downstream throughout the winter. So if you think of the spatial footprint of beavers, there's the wetland that they're forming, so there's a footprint there, but then it's got this long tail down the creek where it's warming water in an environment that's temperature limited, right? I mean, one of the main reasons there aren't more aquatic species in the Arctic is because it's too cold. And so when you add warm water to the landscape like this and trickle it out over winter, you're really encouraging new biological species and just enhanced biological activity, including fish. And I think of it as analogous to, imagine if you were dotting these little creeks and streams across the North Slope with groundwater springs, right? You're adding heat, that's water that's coming out all winter from these beaver dams that's warmer than usual, and as a result, it's sort of an oasis of biologic activity. And just to say one more word about the impacts, imagine if someone walked into the BLM office or the DNR office tomorrow and said, yeah, I've got a plan here. I'd like to dam every third creek in the Arctic, and I'm going to put 3 dams on it, and they're going to move around, and you know, it's almost inconceivable. As someone said, that would be a lot of paperwork. But it's hard to think of other wildlife that have such a big impact on the landscape, and that's why we can see it from space. So here's a picture from satellite image from summer 2008. We've got stream A, stream B, and what happened is the Beaver, there's a confluence right here, right? But the Beaver builds a dam here and sends all that water down this way. There's a series of dams here. And if we look at that in the winter, this gets at this idea of leaking warm water downstream. If we look at that in winter, you see it's frozen up, both rivers are frozen upstream in the winter, but below the dams, the water's open. And this could be, for example, new habitat for spawning salmon. You know, salmon spawning is limited. There's no successful salmon spawning on the North Slope right now because the water's too cold to incubate the eggs. But here's an example where leaking out that warm water over winter could lead to successful, you know, greater fish habitat. But of course, what we don't have in this case, and this is what would be nice, we don't have this winter picture from before beavers arrived, because that would answer this question of whether or not this open water is due to beavers. As it stands here, hey, maybe that open water was open before the beavers arrived, and maybe the beaver even chose that spot because the water was open. So not conclusive, but this is the sort of thing that we're interested in. All right, this is my impacts to fish slide. I don't know a lot about fish, and I think we also don't know what's going to happen to fish, a variety of fish species, when beavers colonize the Arctic, or as they are colonizing the Arctic. And this is an important question because it's a big subsistence resource, and you know, lots of work has been done elsewhere. For example, in the lower 48, lots of work has been done looking at impacts of beavers on fish. And I'd say it's about 2/3 positive and 1/3 negative. You know, beavers create a diversity of aquatic habitat that simply is not there before. So that aspect of it is really positive for fish, but at the same time, dams block passage for certain fish. So I'm hoping that there are people in the crowd, I know there are people in the crowd that know more about this than I do and can answer, you know, possibly answer some questions that arise related to fish. But this is one of the more exciting impacts to me just because, you know, it's a really significant subsistence resource. And as I say, if beavers were allowed to facilitate fish habitat and facilitate fish success in a lot of these Arctic rivers, that would be a big change. All right. Possible causes of beaver colonization of the Arctic. Of course, as I've said, you know, warming temperatures increase shrub habitat. So we know that their shrub habitat is increased. We know that the amount of unfrozen water in these lakes and rivers is increasing. And we know that the winters are shorter. And that shorter winter matters because the toughest time for a beaver, as you can imagine, is when their cache is depleted at the end of winter. You know, they can't go out because it's still snowy and cold, and they don't have feet that are adapted to be out in the cold. And so their cache is running out. Well, winter now ends, you know, 2 to 4 weeks earlier than it did a century ago. So it's definitely a better environment for them in the tundra than it was a century ago. But like moose, and this is part of the reason I talk about moose, they've been recovering from over-trapping in Alaska during the 20th century. So I think beaver regulation, the trapping regulations were initiated about 1910 in Alaska because they had just, you know, really depleted the number of beavers in Alaska, just like they had elsewhere in North America. And so once again, we have this difficult question of you know, which one of these factors is you know, enabling beavers to get a toehold in the tundra. But yeah. All right, that's it. Thank you.